You're listening to the Bloom Europa podcast, a project that privileges new and independent thinking on Europe while discussing its current challenges. In each episode, we take a holistic but hard-hitting approach to analysing pan-European affairs.
Hello everyone, my name is Adherence and I'm your host for today's show. I'm accompanied by Anna Faringer and Carlos Montenegro. So, in our fourth episode, we are talking about what will be the impact of Finland and Sweden joining NATO with Professor Alexander Stubb, who is the director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Professor Stubb was the Prime Minister of Finland between 2014 and 2015. He was also a member of the European Parliament and of the Finnish National Parliament. In addition, he was until recently the Vice President of the European Investment Bank from 2017 to 2020. Therefore, we will discuss everything there is to know about the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO and its impact on European security in the context of the current Russia's war on Ukraine. Furthermore, we would like to remind you that this episode was recorded on the 5th of October. Hello, Professor. Thanks for joining us. We are very pleased to have you here.
My pleasure.
So let us start our conversation with President Putin's last week's speech at the Kremlin, in which he formally proclaimed the annexation of the 4 occupied Ukrainian territories. As you know, President Putin and the other top government leaders in Moscow are making explicit nuclear threats. In fact, senior US and NATO officials have warned Russia that may resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons following their recent battlefield setbacks in Ukraine. In an interview with CNN's Farid Zakaria GPS, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that he expects President Vladimir Putin to continue to suggest he might use nuclear weapons in Russia's war with Ukraine, and that is possible he could actually do so. So my question is, how much of Putin's nuclear threats should be taken seriously?
Well, I think we have to look at Putin's latest activity through 2 speeches. One was the one where he mobilized the troops and threatened nuclear weapons and declared the independence of the regions. And then the second one was, of course, when he annexed those regions to Russia. In many ways, I think it's a turning point in the war. It shows to us that Putin will actually go all the way. He's not going to back down. I also think that talk of nuclear weapons and mobilization are to a certain extent a sign of desperation. Unless you are in real trouble, you don't threaten with the use of nuclear weapons. It's just something that is not done, especially in civilized nations. I think we should take his threats seriously because Putin is very unpredictable and obviously he's in a corner. But I do think that the Americans are engaged in dialogues with the Russians, and the Russians will soon understand why nuclear weapons should not be used.
As you know, President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, announced he was accelerating his country's proposal to join NATO, hours after the Russia declared that it would annex the 4 regions of Ukrainian territory. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said in a press conference on 30th September that Ukraine has a right to apply for NATO membership. However, he added that the possible membership was up to the NATO's 40 member states. In addition, the heads of 9 European NATO members, especially from Eastern and Central Europe, on the 2nd of October, issued a joint statement backing a path to membership for Ukraine in the US-led security alliance, NATO, of course. So in this context, how likely is the adherence of Ukraine to NATO? And what are the consequences of that decision for the alliance and for the European security?
I think the base case or the starting point should be an analysis of what the new European security order looks like. After the Cold War, it was very much based on the principles set out in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in other words, the OSCE, so the Helsinki Accords from 1975, and then built upon by the Paris Accords from 1992, and they had a lot to do with the territorial integrity and sovereignty of nation states, about independence and non-violence. Russia, of course, broke this first in the war in Ukraine in 2000, war in Georgia in 2008, then by annexing the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. And now finally by a full-blown attack on Ukraine. But if the base case is a Europe divided into two and a security structure where on one side you have more or less 40 European states, democracies, including, of course, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and the Western Balkans. And then the other side, you have an isolated Russia. Then I think it's very important that we begin a serious conversation about what the security order looks like. And for me, it looks like those countries who want to join the European Union should be able to do that in the long run, and those countries that want to join NATO should be able to do that in the long run as well. I don't think this change would have happened was it not for Putin's attack. I, for once, don't believe that Finland and Sweden would have joined NATO was it not for Putin's aggression in Ukraine. So I think if we take the long game, Ukraine should become a member of the European Union and of NATO. But of course, this is going to take a long time.
Yes, just a small follow-up question. But as you know, the Treaty of Washington, specifically the Article 5 of the Treaty of NATO, says that a country that is already in conflict, the other allies have to enter in as a united against that attack. If the conflict continues with Russia, don't you think there is that some countries in Europe, especially in NATO countries in Europe, might find the solution of Ukraine getting into NATO a bit, should I say, unwise?
Well, I mean, again, it depends on what kind of time scale you're looking at. I mean, if the base case is divided Europe, I think we need to look at it from a broader perspective. And of course, we're not talking about, Ukrainian NATO membership tomorrow or next year. We're looking at it in the long term. Article 5 and collective defense is very clear. The article's been only used actually once, and that was in conjunction with 9/11. But if we have imperialist, revisionist, and aggressive power on the borders of Europe in the form of Russia, then I think it is our duty to collectively try to defend countries that don't want to be annexed by that particular country. So probably, obviously, Ukraine won't join NATO in the middle of a conflict. But the discussion of joining NATO at a later stage, I think, should take place.
I have a question now. On the 21st of September, after Putin announced partial mobilization, we now have Russian citizens starting to queue up to the border and to leave the country. Finland, which kept its borders with Russia and opened since the beginning of the conflict, announced 2 weeks ago that is going to ban Russian tourists from entering the country, and becoming the last EU neighborhood to do so after Vladimir Putin's decision to order mobilization. leading the calls that the EU should open its borders to Russians. European Council President Charles Michel said last week to Politico, and I quote, that you should do an openness to those who don't want to be instrumentalized by the Kremlin. I would like to ask, what is your perspective on this matter?
Well, I think the issue is a little bit more complicated and complex than the introduction. I mean, first observation is to say that it is my understanding that when we speak, Russia has been able to mobilize roughly 200,000 soldiers, whereas 700,000 have escaped the country. And that's pretty much all over the world. Second clarification is that it was precisely the European Union which was not able to have a united position on the visa ban. And therefore countries like Finland had to take what can be called unilateral measures. It should also be very important to clarify that we're talking about tourist visas, not just like, getting people in. And if you look at the traffic on the border of Finland, it's not been exactly zero sum, but the flows of individuals going out and coming in hasn't shifted radically. So it's quite a calm border at the moment. I think it's a very complex question in the sense that, those that want to escape mobilization, do you give them political asylum? Or do you just allow them, to come in on tourist visas? After all, they're trying to escape a war situation. So I don't have a precise answer on this question, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. So now I have a question about the summit that was decided that Finland and Sweden should become members of the alliance. As you know, this was a decision made on the 29th of June in Madrid. And my question is, ahead of the NATO's Leaders Summit, Turkey lifted its opposition to Finland and Sweden's NATO bid after long negotiations and signed a trilateral memorandum to support the invitation of the countries to NATO. At the moment, and according to, for instance, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the accession process has been very successful. Only Hungary and Turkey have not ratified the accession protocols yet. So do you think that these countries have reasons to delay the accession process or create last-minute obstacles to the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO?
Well, in the bigger picture, I'm not too worried because Finland pretty much got bilateral security guarantees almost immediately after the war began, from the United States, from the United Kingdom and many other NATO countries. So on top of that, we have one of the strongest standing armies in Europe with 900,000 in reserves, 280,000 that can be mobilized in time of war, with mandatory military service, with 62 F-18s, just bought 64 F-35s, one of the most sophisticated land-to-air, air-to-land missile defense systems. And it's not exactly like we have those to defend ourselves from Sweden. So I'm quite relaxed about the situation. I think there is a lot of, mediatic sexiness about who is ratifying when, where, and how. This is, however, the fastest accession process in the history of NATO. And the reason is very simple. Finland is more NATO compatible than most NATO states. So I am as sure as one can be that Hungary will ratify Finnish NATO membership, and then finally Turkey will as well. Whatever the transactional costs are going to be, I don't know.
Right. So Anna, I pass to you your question to be presented.
Hi. So with Finland and Sweden's recent defense spending increases their naval and air force capabilities, many are optimistic that they will be security contributors rather than security consumers. Do you think Finland and Sweden will be helpful in making the European side of NATO more self-sufficient and kind of shift the burden sharing?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Finland is very strong in the air and on the ground. and Sweden is very strong at sea. Our military equipment is completely NATO compatible, and I think the line that Finland took when not joining NATO after the Cold War was to integrate our defense systems so close to the American defense systems that essentially they wouldn't work without American service and help. I mean, I think it's mind-boggling that Finland has more reserves than France and Italy combined. So we're definitely a security provider to the region, and I think our membership will of course increase security in the Baltic Sea region. I mean, our military is much bigger than that of Poland, obviously much bigger than that of the Baltic states combined, bigger than the German one. So I think it's a non-brainer, and that's why it's been so easy to ratify Finnish NATO membership in all the states as well.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, with their strengthening of NATO's hard power, it kind of makes a return to the founding mission of NATO as being a fundamentally military-focused alliance. Going along with your European divided into two and their new security order conversations, do you think this will set a precedent for potential new members of NATO?
I mean, I do think it could. I think NATO certainly has a renewed purpose, and in that sense, you could say that the big strategic blunder from the so-called master tactician Vladimir Putin was that everything that he hoped for went exactly the opposite way. So, Ukraine became European, not Russian. Europe was united, not split. The transatlantic partnership was rejuvenated, not put into the annals of the history books. NATO found a new purpose, much like it had in 1948, as a deterrent to the Soviet Union, now a deterrent to an aggressive revisionist Russia. And then the icing of the cake, of course, has been Finnish and Swedish NATO membership, and now an application from Ukraine. So, at the end of the day, I think most European states will be members of NATO, and this is the legacy of Putin.
Right. As a follow-up to that question, just a small one. In that case, in that context, what do you think about possibly, for instance, a country like Moldova that probably would feel threatened by Russia's aggression in Ukraine because they have their own problems with their territory. So what do you think Moldova position would be? I know that they already are starting to apply for the European Union, but they were prudent not to apply to NATO yet. So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of a domino effect we get here. Of course, there was a domino effect with the EU membership applications, which came chock-a-block after each other for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. I'm sure there are conversations between NATO officials, the US, Moldova, and many others. I think in the short run we probably won't see an application, but in the long run we might. It just depends a little bit on how things settle. And I do think that, as I've said in some of my YouTube lectures as well, I think there's short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications. And I think the short-term focus right now should be on obviously trying to end the war with some kind of a peace settlement. But that peace settlement, to be honest, the only solution I see is that Russia gives back the territories that it has tried to annex, and then protect the near abroad. And that, of course, means the likes of Georgia and the likes of Moldova and Ukraine as well. Because I do think that this is a semi-permanent situation, and certainly it's going to be an issue that is going to last at least one generation.
Right. Just a small question about this. So in that possible political settlement between Ukraine and Russia, do you think that Russia would be willing to give it back, for instance, Crimea?
No, I mean, obviously not, but their military capability is very limited at the moment, and at some stage there's going to have to be a transactional peace. I don't know what it's going to be. I mean, one of the ideas that I've toyed with, which I might be completely wrong on, is that, Ukraine gets back the 4 territories, including Crimea. And then as a transaction, Russia doesn't have to face international prosecution for the war crimes that it has committed. Is there's a cynical view? I don't know. You be the judge of that, but I just don't see any other transactions at the moment which could end the war. And obviously, I think everyone wants to end the war.
Right. So finally, considering your unique experience and invaluable expertise, how do you think, or how do you see yourself contributing to the integration process of Finland in NATO? Do you see any future role in that regard?
No, I mean, I left politics in 2016, and I'm now mostly engaged in, outside commentary. But I've also taken a line that I do not give any interviews in Finland, or if I do, it's very rare. So just to give you an example, I've given almost 500 interviews to international media about the war in Ukraine, but only 2 or 3 in Finland. And the reason for that is that if you're a former prime minister or foreign minister or finance minister, quite often the media then sort of tilts it in a direction whereby I would be criticizing the sitting government. And I don't want that. I've been there, I've done that. I was in government for 8 years. I know it's difficult enough for the people involved. They don't need someone from the outside, giving advice. So if I have any advice, I do it privately. And in that sense, I don't have any role in the accession process of Finland to NATO.
Right, but as a citizen, you can, right? As a citizen.
Yeah, but it's all animals are equal. Some are just more equal than others. So, unfortunately, as a citizen, I'm a former prime minister. So, if I give a view on what Finland should do, then that is considered a political statement in Finland, and I try to avoid that. I enjoy looking at things from the outside and providing analysis. It's actually much more comfortable and, to be honest, much easier as well. So I'm very happy with my role at the moment.
Thank you. Yes. So with that in mind, Professor Alexander Stubb, thank you so much for your discussion and for coming to our podcast.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We kindly invite you to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. You can also check out all the links and resources on the show's notes. That's all for this episode, folks, and we look forward to you tuning in next time. This was a Bloom Europa original production.